talk a little bit about the wilderness this morning, and I want to tell you why, in addition to the fact that we are still experiencing a lot of the pain, a lot of the struggle, a lot of the challenge, a lot of things from COVID and the reactions to it. The other reason is because if you were here last Sunday, you know that I talked about the transfiguration or the transformation of Jesus when God called him up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and he allowed them to see the power of God in the transformation that occurred before these men's eyes. The transformation that occurred in Jesus. They got to see blinding light. They got to hear the voice of God. They had the opportunity to witness who Jesus really is, and it just threw them. They just frankly didn't even know what to do with it. It was so unlike anything they had ever experienced. Sometimes things happen in us that take us to a place a little bit like that. Now I'm saying just a little bit. I don't mean to say any of us have that kind of power or that kind of transformation, but sometimes things happen to us that are really good and really powerful and put us in a place of feeling very confident, put us in a place of being very hopeful, put us in a place of looking forward and just wanting to jump into whatever we're working on. That would have been, I think, a temptation that the story of Jesus' transformation bears out that was happening in at least Peter. You may remember from the story, and you can flip to chapter 9 of Mark if you want to refresh your memory on that. But you may remember that as the voice was speaking and as the physical body of Jesus was changed, at least from the perception of his disciples, Peter just spoke out for them, and his words were, well, they were just frankly because he didn't know what else to say. But he said, "Hey, Rabbi, look, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," the two who were represented with Jesus. An exciting thing was happening, but he didn't even know what to do with it. And I wonder, when something amazing happens with us, something that maybe has, again, given us great confidence to step forward, maybe in a very hopeful way, certainly in a way that we're expecting great things to happen. I wonder if we need to kind of check ourselves like Peter had to be checked. I'm coming back to this transfiguration because this story of the transfiguration, because as we are looking to recovery from being in the wilderness, as we are looking for things to start changing and getting back to ways of what we would call normal, I think there's some things in this story and another one I'm going to share that would serve as good advice for us, good counsel. So again, Peter and James and John witnessed this stunning occurrence, and they were envisioning what's going to happen. What we didn't talk about is what was happening in Jesus. What was happening as Jesus was having the voice of God speak over him? What was happening as he was there with Moses and Elijah talking about what was to come? The departure, his suffering, his death, his way of bringing about God's will. What was happening in Jesus as he was envisioning the power of God acting through him? I think the temptation for a human, the human Jesus, could have been to rush right out and get on with proclaiming the kingdom. I mean, he's already talked about the fact that the kingdom is here, the kingdom is near, and he's calling people to him to be caught up in it, to be drawn to what God was wanting to do. And to have that kind of an experience surely would have given him a very real insight into what maybe God was going to do. A real insight into the power that was available to him. And as that was occurring, again, to come down off that mountain and charge right into the call to start proclaiming the kingdom and performing miracles, and maybe do things that we don't today think of Jesus wanting to do, but in his humanity might be something that we would struggle with. And that is to garner praise himself. That is to try to use the power that God had given him to advance himself. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, Reed, but this is Jesus. Jesus wouldn't do that. But remember, he was human. Remember, Jesus was fully human in addition to being fully divine. The writer of Hebrews talks about Jesus experiencing every temptation that we experience. If you want to jump back a few chapters, go all the way back to the first of Mark, where Mark tells in a kind of a short version when Jesus was baptized. Jesus came without sin. Jesus came as a human, but without sin, to be baptized. And as he was coming up out of the water, a voice from heaven said, "You are my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." Now that's the same voice that said a very similar wording after the transfiguration. So Jesus has now heard the voice of God twice. Talk about how pleased he is with him. Talk about how you might feel God's power. How you might feel the temptation to just charge forward. Surely Jesus was feeling that. And that is the place where Jesus and you and I should expect temptation to come, right? When we're feeling really strong and powerful and good and supported. Now, in this story in the first chapter of John, first chapter of Mark goes on to tell us that as soon as the Lord had spoken those words, the Spirit sent him out, Jesus, into the wilderness. And as he was in the wilderness 40 days, he was tempted or tested by Satan. Why was he tempted or tested? Why, after such a powerful event, would Jesus not have just gone straight into his ministry? Why would the Spirit of God have led him into the wilderness? Well, because he had to prove that he was able to be God's son, right? Well, maybe because he needed to demonstrate to Satan he could overcome Satan's power. Those might both be true, but let me suggest to you one additional reason this morning. What happens to us when we're in the wilderness? What happens when we're in our kind of wilderness? A tough place. A place where we are suffering. A place where we are being tested or tried. A place where we are alone. A place where we don't have what we normally have. What happens to us? It's uncomfortable, isn't it? It's a tough place. We don't like it. And immediately, most of us, once we recognize we're in that kind of place, we want out of it. Nobody wants to stay there. We start calling on any resources or any people that we know that can help us. Get me out of this place. We maybe draw on past experience that we have found successful in getting out of the desert or the wilderness in previous experiences. Again, anything to get us out of it. We've just witnessed that in 2020, right? Look at all the things we tried to do. Look at all the conversation that went on among us as a people to try to get over this. Look at all the different viewpoints and the arguments and all the effort that went into it. We've got to get out of this. Nobody likes to be there. And yet the Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness, and he stays there for 40 days. Why would the Son of God, why would the most powerful figure who's been given definite instructions by the Lord to come and proclaim the kingdom and bring it about, why would he start in the wilderness? Well, let me ask you something. If Jesus, being tempted in every way, if Jesus, being human, had heard God's voice say, "You're my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased," and he was tempted in every way, what do you think he might have been tempted to do? Were the people in that area longing for the Messiah? Absolutely. Were the people suffering under the hands of oppressors and looking for help? Absolutely. Could Jesus not have taken the power available to him and gone out and begun to advance the kingdom? Sure he could have. Let me suggest to you this morning that perhaps the reason that the Spirit of God led Jesus into the wilderness was because he had to make sure that all the things that he as a human might have drawn from were not available. That all of the temptations to pull from things that were known to take care of himself were not going to be taken advantage of. Let me suggest to you that if Jesus was going to be the true human that he was called to be, if Jesus was going to actually not only represent us, but to stand in our place and do what we had not done, live faithfully with God and worship him only, he had to be in a place where all those temptations would be very real. And God had to make sure that knowing who he was wasn't going to trip Jesus up. You think, okay, how does that relate to me today? What does this have to do with me being in the wilderness? Well, think about it. Think about when you're in the wilderness, again, you want out. Any way you can possibly get out. Think about all the things we tend to pull from and draw on. I'm not suggesting we don't pray. We do pray. But what do we do while we're praying? Anything and everything else we can think of to get out of the wilderness, right? To get out of the stuck place. How often do we say as Christians something like this? And I know what we mean. I've said it myself. Maybe you've done the same thing. I've said what I'm getting ready to say, and then I've caught myself and thought, okay, that's not exactly what I meant. And that is when I'm talking to somebody that's in need and struggling, and I say, what else can I do for you? What can I do for you? And they say, pray. And then what do we say? After I will. What else do we say? What else can I do for you? Right? What else can I do for you? I'm praying, but what else can I do? I want to do something. It's a very real human emotion. It's a very real pull on us. And with the power available to Jesus, God had to make certain that that would not be the priority for Jesus. Look at the two men that God brought at the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah. There's no argument among those of us who are Christian how God moved in their lives, right? There's no argument how God had called those two men to do powerful acts. What happened after they did it? What happened to Moses after God worked so powerfully in him to bring the people out of Egypt? They wandered in the desert. The people began to grumble. You remember the story? Among other things that happened, what did Moses do? Out of frustration at one point, he relied on something he had done in the past. Remember when he struck the rock and water came out of it at God's command? Later, out of frustration, he strikes it twice. That wasn't God's instruction. But he had to have it. What happened to Elijah after God had acted so powerfully in him? You remember? We looked at it last week. Go back there a minute. 1 Kings 19. Powerful story. 18, sorry. After Elijah had confronted the prophets of Baal, one on hundreds, you remember? And he taunted them. Come on. Surely your God's going to answer you. And then God acted powerfully. And then in 19, after such an amazing victory, amazing demonstration of power, amazing affirmation of Elijah's calling and who God is in Elijah, what happens? Well, he gets a threat. And he runs. And he says, that's it, Lord, I'm done. I've had enough. Just take my life. In both of these two men, where God had acted with such power, both succumbed when the pressure hit. Different ways. One tries to take power that's not his. The other says, just forget it. Just forget it. Aren't we prone to do that? When God has acted powerfully in ways of ours, and then we hit a dry spell, then we hit a wilderness, then we hit a rough spot in the road, then we hit a job loss, then we hit an illness we can't just quickly overcome. Maybe we hit a relational place that we're stuck. What do? Don't we try to grab anything we know how to do to fix it? If we can't fix it right away, or maybe even if we've persevered and we can't solve the problem, do we despair? Do we sink into pity? Why? What takes us to those places? I want to suggest to you this morning that one of the conditions of all of us humans is that we are prone to pride. We are prone to pride in believing that we ought to be in a better place than we are. And we struggle when we're not. When we have God in our lives and He begins to do powerful things, and we begin to feel better about it, then when we hit a rough spot again in the future, what do? Hey, Lord, we need you to solve this. And the expectation is there. And what happens when He doesn't right away? Well, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I haven't prayed hard enough. Maybe I need to call on other people. Maybe I need to figure out how to work kind of this. Maybe God's waiting on me to use what He's given me to kind of work this thing. There's got to be some way to get me out of this situation. When we look at the human Jesus and we knew what was in front of Him, we know that all the suffering that He was going to have to go through after such amazing power demonstrated by God in His life. surely he was tempted to feel as we do. Surely he was tempted to think there's got to be another way. Jesus needed to have that wilderness experience before the demonstration of God's power. Because God needed to see, would Jesus be loyal above all else? God needed to see, would Jesus put his faith in God? God needed to find out, was the relationship between his son and himself priority? And if you look back at Moses and Elijah, you find God intervening in them in similar ways. When they had had such powerful acts presented through them and for them, and then they struggled, God had to come to them and say, what are you doing? Have you forgotten? Keep the relationship priority. This is a part of the advantage of the wilderness. Most of us don't see the wilderness as an advantage. Most of us look at the wilderness as something to be avoided in the first place, and if we happen to get caught in it, can get out of it as quickly as possible. I want to suggest to you this morning that there may be a better way to look at the wilderness. As a Christian, don't look at the wilderness as something that I've got to get out of immediately. I've got to get out of right away. I don't mean to say you just sit and suffer and say, okay, well, whatever. But I think what we can find in following the example of our Lord is that it is a time to examine our relationship with him and ask ourselves, is he first and foremost in our lives? Is he important enough to me that I'm willing to go through what I'm going through and trust him and hold on to him and wait on him to do what only he can do? Or am I going to resort to what I have in the past? Reach back and try to grab something. Figure out a way to work out of the problem I'm in. It's a pretty practical and a very simple application. But the truth is, if we continue to try, when we're in the wilderness, to do anything and everything to get out of it on our own without relying on him first and foremost, we may very well miss what he's trying to teach us. We may very well miss the emphasis he's trying to put on the relationship. And in fact, we may miss the very purpose for what he wants to do with us when we come out of the wilderness. When Jesus came out of his wilderness, there was immediate power in his ability to resist the temptations that were put on him. When Jesus came out of the wilderness, he was ready to do what God had for him to do. When Moses and Elijah recovered from their wilderness, when they heard the voice of the Lord speaking to them and realized that they had not been forgotten, it was an opportunity for them to rely solely on their relationship with him, the goodness and faithfulness of God. That's what the Lord is looking for out of us. That dependence, that priority is the witness he's calling us to give. We're going to go through struggles. We know that. He doesn't expect us to just sit and wallow in them. But there'll be struggles we go through like we've been through this past year that there's not a thing we can do about it. It's bigger than we are. It's bigger than the resources we have. But if it serves the purpose of drawing us closer to him and increasing our dependence upon him, then we come out a lot stronger than we went in. And the person and place and power of God can now work according to His will. Lord, as you bring us out of this wilderness we've been in, as you bring us out of